Okay, well, welcome to an 8th session study of the Shroud of Turin. If it goes the way I think it will, it might be more, it might be less, but probably about 8. And I'd like to start with a piece of scripture. This is from the Gospel of John. Pilate therefore said to him, "Are you a king?" You say rightly that I am a king. For this cause I was born, and for this cause I came into the world, that I should bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth hears my voice. And Pilate said to him, one of the most interesting questions, I think, in the gospel: what is truth? This is the problem that we're going to have with a lot of things in life. What do you require for something to be considered a fact? What does it take for you? And I'm not trying to tell you what that will be, but that's an issue. You should realize this is, especially maybe the last few years, becoming more of an issue. You have a president who says, if I like the answer, well, then it's a fact. You have an outgoing advisor at the White House that says, we have alternate facts. And you probably realize that in this political environment, when something is said or more often tweeted, it's considered a fact, which everyone can then repeat or retweet as if it's somehow fact. So let's think back. The Hebrews would consult 2 stones that the high priest kept behind his breastplate. And one of them would tell him yes, and one of them would tell him no. That was fact. When you were young, you probably asked your mother about something. And if whatever she said, well, that was probably fact. Probably junior high, you thought about looking at the encyclopedia and deciding that gave you facts. Maybe today you Google the internet, and that's how you get your facts. Well, sources of facts are several. It could be a personal preference. You could say, I like wine. And that would be a testable fact. We could see whether you order it, you buy it, you use it, and so forth. Yeah, our culture would give you facts, such as we're a peace-loving nation. And that's testable also to see, do we really do it? Our faith can give us teachings, such as if you have faith, you can handle snakes and you won't be bitten. I don't know how you feel about that one, but that's in the Bible. Well, we're going to use methods, and we're going to spend time with the scientific method, the evidential method, and the quadrilateral method. The scientific method, of course, is how we worry about things with viruses, medicine, physics, biology, chemistry, and so forth. We're going to go to the evidential method eventually, and it's going to lead us where the courts and historians look at information. And then lastly, we're going to consider the quadrilateral method, which is what was taught to us by John Wesley. Is it ever true that all the methods and preferences basically point to one answer, and yet the people consider the other answer the answer? Such as B's, but the person thinks A is still the right answer, and I'd say yes. We pick husbands and wives this way. Faith might tell us this is not a good pick for you. The culture may say that's not the right person for you to choose. Maybe even a faith or scientific kind of technique of evaluation would say the answer is B. But the man and the woman say, no, we like each other. You have personality, he has broad shoulders and all that and so forth. Then the answer for them is, it's A. And I only raise that because we need to realize that sometimes people go with a particular method or a technique or source, even though the methods might be quite different. At this point, I would raise a question with you about whether you have a faith method. Not because I need to raise this because of the shroud, but I raise it because we struggle in many ways deciding what is going to be the source of what we do. A couple hundred years ago, we quoted all kinds of scripture as a basis for why we have slaves. Split the Methodist Church 3 different ways. Our own denomination this day is struggling with the question of what do we do with homosexuality? What do you quote? Why do you quote it? Do you have a reason to select a particular set of scriptures as being the ones that are important? How did you get to your faith where they are? I can tell you in my own life, I have certain ways that I select scriptures that I think are important, meaningful, useful, and fair. I don't know about the rest of you, but that's something you have to deal with. I can tell you one method that your pastor uses. She may not think of it as part of a method, but she selects what she has as sermons based upon a set of 3 years worth of outline of scriptures to choose from. And because she chooses from the lectionary, she doesn't get stuck on just one theme, Sunday in and Sunday out, Sunday in and Sunday out. It's a useful method to help churches not stay in one theme, one problem, one issue all the time. So I raise that not because it's critical here for the Shroud, but I think it's critical for our faith. The Shroud itself, I'm going to start with a picture that helps us kind of get an image. It's a piece of cloth. It starts below the foot, goes up the back, over the head, and back down to the feet again. This is showing it as if it would be applied at the cross. It would not be done there. It would have been done at the tomb. But this gives some idea of what we're talking about. There are 3 questions before we kind of get started. What is my background to lead this presentation? I would ask you to kind of bear with me for a few minutes. There's a special place where that has to be done in the methods of science, and I will take it up at that point. The second question, how did I get into doing this type of discussion, is fascinating, to me at least. I had retired. Shall we say, I had nothing special that I was going to do right then, and I got a phone call. The lady from our church had seen me do 2 things with the Shroud at the church. She was a librarian at the school. She asked if I would come to the high school and spend all day talking to the advanced placement biology, chemistry, and physics students about the Shroud. I initially agreed. And then I called her back and told her I could not do that because she would get in great trouble. Someone was going to be upset talking about this object. So I said, I can't tell you what I can do. I could teach the characteristics of science, the 10 characteristics, and I can use the Shroud as the example. And since the Shroud is the most studied physical object in our world, who could complain about using that? So that's what I did. It took me 3 months to get my slides all prepared. You're going to see those plus more because I can do things with churches I can't do with high schools. And I presented them year after year, going and checking the students all out for all day. And we had discussions about this topic. The last thing I would cover is this word you see in red, Shroud Man. I'm going to be hopefully consistent. So where I'm talking about the person that made the image on the Shroud, I call it Shroud Man, as opposed to saying it as if it's Jesus. Jesus is obviously going to be used too when it's something that is associated with the history of him. The Shroud Man, we're going to start out understanding is whoever made the image in the Shroud. Is it possibly the same person? Possibly not. That's where we have to start. So we're going to spend half of our sessions looking at the scientific method. That'll be about a month. Then we'll spend a couple of weeks on the evidential method. And then we'll spend the last time on the quadrilateral method. Here's some of the issues I'd like to work on, but you can tell by the red stars, they're not even. The biggest question started out with, is the image authentic? We have something to say about that now. Is it the shroud of Jesus? Well, we're going to spend some time on that too. Then we get into the question of, how was the image created? Ooh, we have less and less to say. And basically on the, how did the process get started to do it? Well, there's not really anything to say at this point. So that's kind of where we're starting. The facts about the authenticity, I want to show you what's happened since I started reading in 1978. And these are using the methods on the right side. When I first started, we had two medical opinions that said it's authentic, but nothing else in the science area. In the evidential method, the historical sort of stuff, we had two things that said it was authentic, but we had a bishop's memo that said, nope, I know who faked it as a painting. And then we also had, and this impacted both the quadrilateral and the evidential, the washing of the body didn't work with what was expected. So we had a few no's and just a few yeses. Well, fast forward to 1990. You can see all kinds of A's have been added. Science has now had its time to study the shroud and finds all kinds of things to suggest it's got to be authentic. Likewise, in the history area, all kinds of things say authentic. Likewise, more study in the quadrilateral area says authentic. So we still have the bishop's memo. We still have the washing of the body problem. But now we've added carbon dating, which says, nope, can't be authentic. It's only medieval. All right, come up to 2005. We now know that the bishop's memo was a fabricated memo. We now know that the carbon date, they carbon dated the wrong thing. We've had a chance to see the underside of the shroud, and that suggests it's authentic. We have a vanillin test that's been performed, which says it's probably authentic. And the washing of the body, well, strangely as it turned out, now we realize how they correctly washed the bodies or dealt with the bodies. And that suggests it's authentic. Come up to 2007. The weave of the cloth is now suggestive of being authentic. 2015, a coin study that we'll talk about suggests it's probably authentic. And my last thing I have is of 2016, 3 cloth dating methods have been developed which suggest it's authentic. So if you look all over that, you don't see any ends. And the reason I raise that is because if you're coming to this anticipating that I'm going to give pros and cons, you can see I would have a problem coming up right now with cons. The things point toward it being authentic, even though that was not true when I started. So how do I go about it? Well, for the students, and I think it still works nicely, I started with a formula. Does Shroud Man equal Jesus? And I took it as a scientific method. And then we'd stay on that same question and we'd shift to the evidential method, kind of like the historians use. But when we came to that last question, is Jesus the prophesied figure? Well, science and evidence don't really go that direction. But the quadrilateral could be used. And so we will use it for that last part of the formula. For the high school students, it was strictly Shroud Man equal Jesus. It was strictly scientific method and evidential method. So what I'm trying to do tonight is actually go one step beyond, and that's what I've done in churches. I've had a chance to go to Roman Catholic churches. Baptist churches, Methodist churches. I've had a chance to have people who are atheists, people who don't want anything to do with the church. I've had a variety of people who are medically trained, some who are involved in the shroud work. So it's gone through several. This is this is version number 20 in my series that I've had over the years. So it keeps changing just a little over time. At this point, let's review what Jesus' death is like. He began teaching in the 30th year of his life. And of course, for a Hebrew to be considered an elder, he had to be 30. Especially, I would think, with Jesus, since he had been in the construction industry. Death is estimated to be at age 33, although we have one gospel that might be worked out to be more like 18 months. The scriptures tell us he was mocked, he was spat on, he was struck. They pulled his beard, maybe pulled out chunks of it. He was scourged by the Roman guards, which is a whipping system they had while they chained them up. He had a crown put on him. We'll see that the style is not the Greek wreath, but more like a helmet. He was tied to, and he carried a crossbar only, estimated to be 75 to 125 pounds typically. He fell more than once, apparently unusually weakened. Death occurred after Passover Thursday. Crucified on Friday outside Jerusalem. The Hebrews had a deal with the Romans. I don't know how they got it organized, but at any rate, they wanted everyone to be off the crosses by definitely end of day, but definitely before a holy day. And Sabbath being a holy day, they wouldn't want them off. Typically, of course, what they did was the body was hauled to the garbage dump. Death occurred early, and Pilate was rather surprised. Legs were not broken. That was certainly rare, but his side was pierced. A person was allowed to bury him. We only have evidence of one burial. So this is a rather rare thing. He was buried according to Jewish custom, buried in a wealthy, unused tomb. The official Roman seal was placed from the stone to the rock face. Guards remained, probably 4 in number after it was sealed. Yet he was not in the grave clothes on Sunday. Guards, though, were still present. Guards normally would be killed for letting a prisoner escape. But these were not. And scripture says they would be safe by saying that they were asleep. Well, normally they'd be killed for sleeping. The Hebrew burial custom of that time, this was a sticking point for a long time. The women did the preparation inside the tomb. They had a special cloth to cover the head as they prepared. They washed the body, put spices on it. If they put coins, they put them on the eyes, not in the mouth, which was a pagan custom. They tied the chin closed, tied the wrists together, tied the legs together. They took away the face cloth, and that's where they put the shroud on, up and over the top. They closed the tomb then for a year and would then return to collect the bones after everything's rotted away, place it in some type of a limestone box, and that would be left in the tomb. This is a real sticking point, as I indicated before, about the shroud. Well, what we learned in the last 20 years was when they had a violent death, they did not wash the body. And that certainly makes sense with what we see on the shroud. There's no evidence of the blood being washed away before it was placed in the shroud. Now, violent means a loss of what they called a half log. It's near to our half cup of blood of a certain type. And some of you may have seen the movie, The Passion of the Christ. And that was pretty much without any, as I recall, any narrative So you didn't get an explanation as to what you were seeing, but there was a scene in there that probably meant very little to Christians. After Jesus had been whipped and he went out then to be crucified, two ladies came in and took cloth and wiped up the blood. That doesn't mean much to us, but to them it meant he needed his blood for his resurrection. And so they were wiping it up in order to have it available for him for his resurrection. This is quite different from our usual way of thinking of things. And like I say, only in the last 20, 25 years have we realized that not washing the body, trying to save all the blood they could, was an important part of their burial system. Now, I need to start by saying there isn't a single thing that I can say today that will not be objected to by someone, including that Jesus even lived. You may not find that logical that people still claim that no, there's all kinds of materials that say this man it's all made up. This didn't really happen. So I thought this would be a good place to start. Let's take the question of Jesus having lived. What the total number of trustworthy ancient manuscripts available for translators on ancient noteworthy people? Here you see some ancients. We're going to have several pages of them. I would imagine you've heard of Cicero, Virgil, Horace the poet had lots of things that are written down about him. Pliny, 200. Homer was, of course, a poet, 670 items. Plato, only 7. Aristotle, only 3. Euclid, the mathematician, only 6. Tacitus was a Roman historian. He had 36 things that are still ancient manuscripts that we have about him. Josephus was the Jewish historian, only 8 things by him. These are old, trustworthy manuscripts, useful to translators. So let's just have fun here. How many manuscripts do you think there's going to be about Jesus? Ancient, trustworthy manuscripts. Now, I can't see your hands, but I'm going to ask you to think in your head. How many think there's going to be? Now, if I can hear you rumbling around, say, well, there's Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. I mean, as Christians, we're not usually told to come up with how many things really document this man. Let me stun you by telling you that Jesus is more documented than all the ancients combined. And that's even discounting apocryphal New Testament items. I hold up, I think you can see this. There's a book of all kinds of things called the New Testament Apocrypha. And in it, there's 144 items. Well, even rejecting all those, you still have all kinds of fragments in full text. Jesus is well documented, but it's not just that there are lots of them. The question of reliability also comes into play. All the copies we have of all the documents we have about the ancients are copies. The average time between Jesus and the copies we have is averaging around 719 years. The average time between the non-Jesus people and the copies we have of them is over 1,000 years. The guess would be then the materials about Jesus probably are a little bit more reliable than the others. So well documented. The issue, of course, is that the shroud, if it's authentic, if it's really the burial cloth of Jesus of Nazareth, it reinforces the central issue of the Christian faith, that a man God was resurrected. And that means it's the absolutely most emotionally divisive physical object that's ever existed, if someone understands what it's all about. But I swear to you that Science doesn't have a problem with that. A scientist might have a problem, but the methods and the standards are applied to the shroud just like any other physical object. So the scientists as individuals, yes, they may have a problem. We'll see how they try to deal with this so that my biases and your biases are counteracted as science applies its methods and standards. So what we're going to do, we're going to have a demonstration of the 10 characteristics of science. And we're going to use the Shroud of Turin as the example. And the question will be something like, could the Shroud of Turin be the burial cloth of Jesus of Nazareth? Notice it's not saying, could the shroud be the burial cloth of Christ, that prophesied figure? I said we would take, because you're a church group, we can take that up and use the quadrilateral method and look at that question separately. But if we're at high school, we wouldn't be doing that. Some quick facts. The image on it is a straw color, and it's extremely faint. The image cannot be seen by someone if they get within 6 feet of the shroud. I don't know whether you know this, but you probably noticed in the past, if you had a bunch of lines that are blue alternating with a bunch of lines that are red, and they seem to vibrate, it's because your eye actually vibrates just left and right, just slightly. And it makes the colors on the thing change enough that it seems like the blue versus the red makes it vibrate. Well, you have to back away 6 feet from the shroud before you can see the line. Your eye can detect that line. The shroud seems awfully young. And the best thing I just think of is like a tan t-shirt. Now, I'm going to hold this. I'm sorry you can't be here. I have this thing that is the shroud in miniature. And it's in the right, well, it's in a material that's as close as they can get it to being like what the shroud was. The t-shirt is the word that comes to mind as to try to get it in our heads. It's very thin. Now, why would that be? Well, you wouldn't want to have much around the body because you intend within a year that all the meat is going to deteriorate and the cloth is going to go with it. So a thick cloth is of no particular advantage. The shroud was kept rolled up in a silver casket until it was finally changed to flat storage in the year 2002. It was owned by the Italian king, who then gave it to the Roman Catholic Church. It's only been out of its casket about 300 days for exhibition since 1357, which is when it gets its current documentation. I did a quick calculation last night. Of its total time since 1357, it's probably only been out of the casket 0.03% of its time. It's very limited. Typically 3 times a century, although recently it's been more often. I have not been able to see a next projected. Some have said 2025, but I've not seen that in print. In 1357, the shroud becomes public in Europe. And we get into the pre-science or the medical kinds of stuff. At the Savoy Palace in Turin, here's where the shroud presently is located. It was in this silver casket in a rolled up form, covered by red silk in the casket. It looked like this in terms of its application, but additionally, they supported the head. They put a band around the chin to hold the jaw shut. They put a band around the wrist to offset. They put a band around the ankles. And then they put them inside the shroud. The guess is, of the various ways that you might use a shroud, probably number 4 is the correct way to see it. They, of course, were in a hurry, so for them to simply put him in it and kind of bunch it around him with some of the spices would probably be what happened that day. It was not out flat. It didn't have it extensively wrapped around or anything like that. They would return in a year, collect just the bones. They put them in a box if they had enough money to be able to do that. And then the box would be left in the burial area. So in a typical burial chamber, you might have a bunch of boxes of the family members. You might have 1 or 2 bodies that are currently decomposing in their first year. The weave is called a 3-to-1 herringbone weave. On the right side, you have the plain over, under, over, and so forth. But somewhere along the way, someone invented, after 800 BC, a fancier weave of going over and then under several. And it's a lot more expensive that way. There is a textile expert who made this drawing to explain that not only was a 3-to-1 herringbone weave, it was a superb 3-to-1 herringbone weave, which meant it cost even more money. I don't understand all that drawing, but that was an attempt to explain to us lay people that this piece of cloth is really important. The weave was common, but generally in silk in the 1st century. The limited amount of cotton would have come from ancient Egypt. They didn't know what kind of cotton it was. This loom was using flax for this particular cloth, but there are traces of the cotton, but no wool. Well, cotton wasn't used in Europe in 0 AD, and the Hebrews didn't permit wool and cotton to be used on the same loom. So this would be one of those cases where they would conclude the shroud is probably then of Middle East origin and from Hebrew looms. Now, I raise this simply to say this is one of dozens of examples that the scientists would cite in saying that if the shroud's fake, the 1357 perpetrator had to know an awful lot of stuff that we're only learning more recently. So we could make conclusions like this and start making a list. The shroud was used in normal Jewish burial manner, 1st century, Middle East origins, probably Jewish for looms. And the shroud had to be bought by a very wealthy person. What's the advantage of this list? This is, shall we say, a layman's list. Well, we're going to keep building this list, and we will have to address every item on this list if we try to come up with an explanation or a conclusion that it's not genuine. Sometimes you'll find a book and it'll say, oh, I know how you make a shroud. Oh, here, you do X, Y, Z, and you slap a little bit of red paint on it, and there you got it. And they actually write books and publish them. Well, no, it's not quite that simple. There is a list of stuff that has to be fulfilled if you're going to try to match the shroud and understand the shroud as we do. I think the scientist list that I last saw had 178 items on it that had to be fulfilled in order to explain it or to say that it wasn't genuine. The explanation would have to cover it all. We have darkened the images many times, as you're going to see. Here's the full 8x2 view. Now, 8x2 are Assyrian cubits of measurement, but they're, of course, are 13 feet 3 inches by 3 feet 7 inches. You see at number 1, the point where the 2 head images come together, one going each way. You see at number 2 a stain, and you'll see several of those along the edges. At one point, this shroud had to be stored in a jar in some manner, and there was some liquid that stained in a certain pattern. You see at number 3 the patches that were put on the shroud when there was a fire and it damaged the shroud. We'll see more of that. And then you see number 4, and those are 2 pieces of cloth that are put in to replace something that was cut out at some point in history, either because it was frayed, torn, something. We know they held it when they did exhibitions, they held it by the corners. And so they may have gotten to the point they were so ratty that they had to replace them with something. The opinion is that we're looking at a male Sephardic Jew, about 5 feet, 10.5 inches tall, who had the unbound pigtail hair that was kind of common. I'm looking now in normal, not darkened. I'm looking now at the normal shroud, one end only. And what you see mostly when you look at it is all the damage from the 1532 fire and the patches that were put on by the Poor Clare nuns to try to cover the damage enough to keep it together. After the fire, they sewed it onto a piece of cloth so that there are 2 pieces together, the original shroud and the cloth behind it, and then these patches on top to try to hold everything together. Mm. I know it's hard to find the shroud man, so I will give you a clue as to where he is. His head's to your left, feet to your right. Is it easier to find it now? I would think so. Goes down the middle. Basically, it was missed almost 100% by the damage. And on the back, with head to the right, feet to the left, again, down through the middle, almost not touching at all the damaged areas. There's no evidence of decay. There's no fluid leaks from body orifices. There's no decline in rigor. The back is not flat. There's no double image. So we could add to our list, the man remained in the shroud less than 4 days. Now, if you think back to something in the Bible, Jesus goes to the tomb of Lazarus and he says, roll back the stone and let him out. And of course, Martha, no, Lord, there's going to be a stink. In 4 days in the heat in the Middle East, yes, it's going to stink already. It's going to be decomposing already. And of course, Jesus says, Lazarus, come forth. And he does, and he's all right. But the 4 day is really a critical thing given the heat of the environment in which they were in. So we're finally to characteristic number 1 of science. We attempt to identify sources of bias. Anything that would cause the scientist or me to hope for a specific answer to a question. Anything that would cause the scientist to miss something. Anything that would cause the scientist to add error to the interpretations. And certainly in today for us, an excellent beginning point is why is the study being done in the first place? For example, are you studying the effects of wine because you are paid by the wine industry to study this subject? Is there any bias here? If you're studying the effects of aspirin, are you being paid by the aspirin industry? That's a good question. So I start with, let me tell you about me. I told you I would get into this eventually. I was raised in a United Methodist minister's family. I'm an active, professing United Methodist member. I generally accept the Gospels as accurate. I do believe that miracles can occur. I was trained in the philosophy of science, the methods of research, statistical analysis. I had a career that started out in college teaching, then I went to being a government researcher and a government budgeter, and finally I became an unpaid church volunteer. How's that? I'm a reader, not a researcher of the Shroud topic. I'll give you some opinions at various places, but I'm a reader, not a researcher. I don't have access to materials that allow me to research. Why did I get into it? Well, I have to admit, up to 1978, I was a little bit like a doubting Thomas. I'd like to have a little bit more evidence. Thomas and I could speak the same language, I'm sure, in quite many ways. And I was raised speaking the English language. That becomes important. What I'm trying to do here is clarify. I have pink glasses, don't I? I have spectacles that I'm looking through that cloud the way I see things. And of course, then I can focus on you. What kind of family were you raised in? What kind of an active, professing church member are you? How do you feel about the Gospels? How do you feel about miracles? What was your training? What was your experience? How do you ever hear about this topic? Why are you even willing to listen to me? That's a fair question. And were you raised speaking English? That may sound, again, like a strange question to ask, but I'll show you why it's important. Since you have two hands and neither of them are busy right now, put out one hand in front of you and take the finger on the other hand and point to where the middle of your hand is. Got your spot picked out? I can't see you, obviously, but I'm guessing that most of you probably ended up about there. Yes, Julie, you got it just right. And the reason you got it there is because you're an English speaker. We've only known in the last 25 years that the Aramaic word for hand went further up. As a result, the middle of the hand was in the wrist. Oh, you see, these things do make a difference. And we've always wondered when people said, you crucified him by putting a nail in the middle of the hand. Well, if you put it where Julie put her finger, it won't hold a person's body on the cross. It tears through the remaining ligaments and so forth, and the body falls off. But if you put it through the wrist, oh yes, that will hold the body on the cross with no problem. Like I say, it's only been the last few years we've realized this. So in this characteristic of science number one, where we attempt to identify sources of bias, we have the scientists trying first to do the blue things. Count what you can count and try to describe what it is, like a tear, a spot, a mark, or what is it? Then hopefully the scientists, and I'm thinking here of several scientists, will start to try to come to an agreement. Is it black? Is it blue? Is it deep? Is it shallow? Is it dumbbell? Is it square shape? What? How do you describe it in some manner? And only after all that happens to the left side do you do the one in yellow, the scourge, the interpretation, where you try to figure out, okay, now what actually happened? So here we see the back in darkened images, and you can see all kinds of marks, and there are 125 of them, and they're judged to be dumbbell in shape. There's an approximate model being drawn there. I'm trying to hold up in front of my hand to give you an idea if I can get it to show. Does that show about right? It's even better when I can hand it around. Give you some idea of what the end of that might have looked like in size. There, that's probably better. Whoops, there we go. This is not the right materials, but it's made with a leather. It's made with metal, and you can kind of see the barbells on the Roman whipping system. They had all kinds of these. Some of the drawings that you can find on the internet look like these because they didn't necessarily always put them at the end. Sometimes they ran them on down. The idea was when you whip the person, you really whip them. And they applied it to the person in this manner. You chain them to a post, take clothes off of them. One or two people, two in the case of Shroud Man, are then hit a certain number of strokes as their punishment. In 1978, they realized that 3BB, a spot on the shroud, there was a piece of muscle. And then they also figured out later that there are epidermis cells and a corpuscle near the feet. Now, this might be intriguing. You might think, oh, goody, science can do some things. Well, let's understand the Vatican owns the shroud and everything that goes with it. And they have to approve a research concept or they disown the material. And as you can probably guess if you think about it a little bit, there's never going to be a day the Vatican's going to approve for someone to do research on the muscle of Jesus. So you can probably pretty much hang that up. We can put down then on our list, whipping methods match the Roman method, number, instruments. Okay, now we get to the wrist. The 4 straight fingers point to a Jewish man. The pagans and the Egyptians molded a burial fist for their people. Notice it's arm method number 1. We're going to have several methods of crucifixion of the arm and also several methods for the feet. According to the materials that have been presented the most, like 99% of the time, they present the nail as going through the space of desktop in the wrist. But it won't surprise me if we don't revise that someday. A very well-respected medical examiner thinks it went through the Z area, he calls it. And that wouldn't make any difference. The mechanics and everything would work. And he's got a good point, so we'll see how that plays out. In any event, whether it goes to the right, as you see the spike here, or goes to the left of that red dot you see, the nail is touching the median nerve. And in the mechanics of what happened once you're on the cross, you're going to move on that nail, which means you are going to be moving on that nerve. How much pain? Well, we have a word called excruciating, which means out of the cross pain. Gives you some sense of what it means. This is going to be a terribly painful thing, the way nailing method number 1 is. Now, there were other methods that didn't require nailing. There was a time in the late 1st century where they had the victim sit on a peg with the arms tied. And that was then, they were there for a long period of time. We have the right foot. See at the red arrow, the right foot. And I have to warn you that the images are constantly being reversed left and right. Whether you're looking at it in photographs or something, it's hard to keep the left and right straight part of the time. But you'll notice the left foot, which is your right image you're seeing there, is a lot shorter. The Russian Orthodox Church, since the 5th century, has had the idea that Jesus was a lame man. And because of that, the crossbar at the bottom is put at an angle. And it's because of the difference in the leg length that seems to be obvious on the shroud. Now, if you were with me in 2016 when we did this here at the church, that's where I stopped. Well, something's happened in the last few years. Coin collectors have been doing some work on the shroud questions. And up to that point, they've been focused on the faces of the coins, but they started focusing on the rest of it. And if you look at the red arrow, you see a leg that is much smaller than the other one. suggesting that yes, they had seen the leg difference. They even put it into the coinage that they had. Well, the foot nailing location number 1 is the one that seemingly was used for Shroud Man, and it goes between the toes, up high. And when it does that, it hits 2 nerves. The mechanics of the thing are such that, let me back up on that one. The mechanics are such that he's going to have to press down on his feet where the 2 nerves are at the nail. There is another method that has, and I hold this one up, trying to get, again, some sense of how size of it, or a replica, if you will. This is actually the best documented nailing position, is number 2. They actually found a victim who was buried, and you see it almost in the middle of your screen. The nail had hit a knot in the wood, and it wouldn't come out of the ankle. The reason there aren't many nails to look at is that they were considered, I find this odd, a good luck charm. People wanted to have nails of crucifixion victims for good luck. I haven't figured that one out personally yet, but that's what they had. So this is actually the best documented nailing position, where the person was without sagging on the thing. They were on a seat and their feet were somehow nailed sideways. And again, this was the second half of the 1st century. This method of crucifixion was relatively bloodless, and the person could be on the cross for weeks. You might find that odd because we think of crucifixion happening quickly, getting it over with. Well, no, that wasn't the original deal. The purpose of crucifixion was to set an example of what happens if you mess with the Roman Empire. So the best deal was to have someone crucified where the public walked by each day and would see them and realize that was true. I doubt that you know the name Sepphoris. Sepphoris was a major town just about 4.5 miles from Nazareth. It was an administrative Roman center, a massive place with all kinds of public works, amphitheater, housing, rich housing. My guess is probably Jesus, if he's in construction, worked there some. And I raise it because in 6 AD, Judas the Galilean led a revolt. 2,000 people were crucified, 21 feet apart on both sides of the road from Sepphoris to Nazareth. So whatever Jesus' age was at that point, he definitely understood what crucifixion meant. The third nailing position is something that apparently was limited to Rome, or at least to the Roman environment. There they nailed from the sides and had the person facing the cross. And we know it from a couple of drawings and magic medallions. But going back to Shroud Man, whoever made the image on the shroud we're talking about, you've got a person who's nailed in the wrists and in the feet, and they are going to sag up and down between 65 and 55 degrees in a seesaw manner. They sag down because of the pain, but they have to push up on their feet in order to be able to breathe. So you've got both foot pain involved. You've got, of course, the wrist pain from swinging back and forth, but you got the breathing problem. And so you see it here in the person is trying to shove up hang down, shove up to get air, hang back down, twisting probably as it happens until eventually a shoulder comes out of place. And that does show up on the shroud. You see here at 1 and 2 what appears to be 2 lines of blood flow. And seeing it more clearly at the wrist, you can see the 2 patterns. Sometimes the blood is flowing at 55 degrees. Sometimes the blood is flowing at 65 degrees. Now the nailing in the first position, where you force the feet downward to the wood cross, requires the body to arch forward. And that is opposed to being nailed from the side, which is the second and the third. The method of using the nailing in the first position inflicted the maximum amount of stress on the person in the shroud. Air Force cadet volunteers in air-conditioned rooms were tied in this position, but they struggled to breathe. And after even in an air-conditioned room, in 15 minutes, there was sweat on the floor below them. It's a very stressful thing. So we can say that the foot nailing indicates a desire to inflict the maximum pain. Now that may seem like a strange statement to make, but let's understand the Jews had the deal with the Romans that people would be off the cross. So it may well be that they said, okay, if we can't have them up there to show them off over a period of days and weeks, then we're really going to put it to them when they're actually on the cross. To finally end their pain, they break the legs. They had a special word they used in Latin. And we have some examples of broken legs from other excavations. Shroudman doesn't show any evidence of breaks. So we can have unbroken shroud legs are unusual. We're at the point of starting into the lance. You remember, because he seemed to be dead, they didn't break his legs, but now they decided to confirm that he was dead. And so here you see the hole that would have the lance go through it. I'll take it away. The repair patch to the right, of course, is one of those things covering where the damage was done from the fire. The lance, well, it would look about like this. Try to give you some sense of, maybe this shows it pretty well. About 1 3/4 inch wide, not too thick. They have some in museums. The lance would be applied, and it would not take much to check out Shroudman.
Ow! Stop it.
Pardon? Oh? Shall I back up? There was the stabbing of the wound. So it'd be about 3 inches into the heart, confirming with blood and water coming out. The Shroudman was dead. So we'll put the Roman lance thrust into the heart, and we're now ready to start the blood flows on the head. But since that's going to go for a while, Pastor Pat, I think we're probably at the point of ceasing to have the active video part and shift into the question part. And I'll leave my screen such that I can back up if that seems to be appropriate.